with William F. Buckley, Jr. Tonight's guest, Leo Cherne, Chairman of the Executive Committee of Freedom House. Tonight's topic, McCarthyism, past, present, and future.
My guest tonight is, roughly speaking, an expert on everything and the master of every discipline. He is a musician, a sculptor, a lawyer, an economist, and a polemicist without peer. Ever since he was a very young man, he was renowned for his orderly habits of mind. Accordingly, his principal profession during the 30s was to interpret New Deal regulations to businessmen. He became the executive director of the Research Institute of America, which specializes in marshaling order out of the economic and legislative data which swirl about our busy and bureaucratized world. I'm confident that when Mr. Cherne leaves this vale of tears, he will present himself to St. Peter with a computerized log of all the arguments for his instant admission. Mr. Cherne usually arrives for television engagements with charts, rulers, slides, maps, graphs, balloons, anything to drive home his point. One of his points a dozen years ago was that Senator McCarthy had become a great threat to that order so dear to Mr. Cherne's meticulous mind. Today, McCarthy is dead, but not absolutely forgotten. He has become an established hobgoblin, and the word McCarthyism has made its way into the dictionary as a synonym for a whole glossary of unpleasant things. It is difficult to go a day without seeing a reference to McCarthyism. So, in a reflective mood, we thought to reach back into history today and discuss McCarthy and his works. Mr. Cherne, you're very welcome.
I wasn't altogether sure that I was quite as welcome when you made reference to my departing this vale of tears and greeting St. Peter.
I didn't mean to say I was going to accelerate that.
I want to make sure of that. I think we're not merely reflecting historically on a phenomenon which has purely historic interest, though that alone deserves some occasional thought. I think we have reason to be concerned not only with the protection of what you describe as the America I hold dear, but I suspect that I am at least as energetic in trying to protect the America we both are concerned about. My concern with McCarthyism is a concern not with a man now gone, but a concern which I do find you on occasion expressing against the oversimplified view of history, of problems, of the devil or conspiratorial interpretation of dread events. We live in a complex time, and at the moment a very trying time. It's indeed frustrating for many Americans to know that we have the power here at home and overseas to inflict the kind of punitive cost on North Vietnam, perhaps even Red China, and are not doing so, and in the process bleeding, working, trying, agonizing. Most of us who inhabit the responsible portion of this political spectrum understand that there are responsible reasons why, in fact, we use less than the total power at our command.
I think by now we have an idea as to what tonight's program will be. We will continue with Firing Line in just a moment.
Mr. Cherne, I think that that you were wise in using the word oversimplification, because there is a sense in which that continues to be central to the whole problem of understanding McCarthy and McCarthyism. The reason I say that is this. In the first place, it's true that most politics are carried, most politics as they are fought at a polemical level tend to be oversimplified. What makes it so interesting in attempting a historical assessment of McCarthy is that his oversimplifications were judged to be almost unique and highly damaging and utterly unassimilable, whereas the contemporary oversimplifications of a Harry Truman, or subsequently, or before that of a Franklin Roosevelt, or subsequently of a Lyndon Johnson, are not thought of
let
as
me
being
see-
that offensive.
Let me suggest, Mr. Buckley, that there were, in fact, very unique elements in his oversimplification.
What were some of those?
Well, quite specifically, to suggest, for example, that General Marshall lied about his whereabouts on the morning of Pearl Harbor, and to suggest, as Senator McCarthy did, that in fact he was meeting Maxim Litvinov at the Washington airport, when in fact this was not true. This is not oversimplification in the normal language of political discourse. To suggest that General Marshall was the head of and most infamous participant in a conscious conspiracy against the United States in the interests of a devious foreign power, the Soviet Union, this is not oversimplification in the normal language of political discourse.
I'm interested that you gave me a generic rather than a particular, or gave me a particular rather than a generic example, because, of course, it's easier to do, but hardly, I think, as satisfactory to your case.
Which do I understand you would prefer, the particular or the generic?
No,
Then let me
Let
generalize.
me just ask you, for instance, to give me the complement of the following
Yes.
quotes. Powerful forces like those that created European fascists are working through the Republican Party to undermine American democracy. President Harry Truman, 1952. Now, is there a sense in which McCarthy was unique in a way that Harry Truman was not unique
Oh,
using
yes,
that kind
indeed.
of rhetoric?
Let me say, incidentally, that I find that not among Harry Truman's most precise, appetizing, or distinguished.
But this is the way they always
utterances.
handle the
Just
subject,
one
isn't it?
second, just one second.
It's unappetizing in
There
Truman,
is,
but
however,
hideous in McCarthy.
Oh, no, there is a difference, and you're bright enough to see the difference. Difference is that Harry Truman does not, in fact, suggest that those operating within the Republican Party are, in fact, in league with. He is suggesting that they are somewhat similar to. Now, there's a profound difference between making that suggestion, which incidentally I think to be quite unwarranted, and a suggestion that Dwight D. Eisenhower was General Marshall's chief lieutenant in a conscious retreat from victory.
Well, presumably, if there are forces
Incidentally,
working for the elimination of American democracy within the Republican Party, those are forces that are represented by individuals. At this time, Mr. Dewey, Thomas E. Dewey, was running for President of the United States, and it seems to me very difficult, that you find yourself in a difficult position to suggest that Mr. Truman was not trying to communicate to the people in general, that Dewey was in some way an agent of those forces. Now, I join with you in deploring, as I did in this book, those excesses of Senator McCarthy, but I have wondered why it is that people who talk about McCarthy have always got to spend their time deploring his excesses when we let everyone else's excesses go by. When last did you deplore, for instance, although I know that you internally deplore, a Linus Pauling, say, who said that Truman and Dewey had brought us to the brink of war and fascism?
Incidentally, how many public occasions would satisfy you for me to have expressed my acute distaste for Linus Pauling?
Let's put it this way.
I.F. Stone.
You have a considerable reputation as a tough, unsparing anti-communist, and as such I greatly respect you, as I think and hope you know. But you also have a reputation as a tough critic of McCarthy. Now, I can understand your criticisms of McCarthy, but I'm asking you now to speak as a representative of the anti-McCarthy community, which found itself sort of perpetually horrified by his excesses, which have even entered into the dictionary at this moment.
Mr. Buckley, I'm not going to speak for the anti-McCarthy section of the community. I'm going to speak for myself.
And you
For
want this about-
myself, I was horrified, as I have not since nor before, by a phenomenon truly unique. Now, there were a number of things which made that phenomenon unique. First of all, I was startled that those with a consistent anti-communist background like yours would not have been appalled by the fact that Senator McCarthy was first elected to the Senate in a primary race against the most active and distinguished anti-communist in the Senate, Senator Robert La Follette. And in the campaign to knock off Senator La Follette, who at that very time was conducting a civil liberties inquiry bleeding the Communist Party, in Senator McCarthy's race
I can save you a lot
just
of
one
trouble.
moment, let me, don't save me the trouble.
Okay.
The audience may wish some of this trouble.
Yeah.
At that particular moment, the Communist Party of the state of Wisconsin threw its substantial resources behind Senator McCarthy in order to enable him to win that primary race.
They thought he was a liberal. Just that simple. McCarthy, look, I can say
Incidentally, let me say, no.
Joe McCarthy didn't discover communism until 1950. He just plain didn't. As a scholar told me that one of these days, Joe McCarthy is going to acknowledge the existence of the Soviet Union. He didn't do that till 1953.
One moment. You say he did not discover. This is another part. There is less understood and more said about this man, I'll agree with that, than almost any other man in American politics. But I'm startled at you. You say he did not discover communism until 1950. Well, it was in February 1947 that I participated in a town meeting program of the year, debating Senator McCarthy on the subject of communism, and I participated at the request of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover.
Well,
now, he did manage somehow or other to stumble into that discovery in 1947.
I'm not suggesting, Mr. Cherne, and please don't wring out my metaphors quite so tightly, that Senator McCarthy was unaware of the existence. I mean that he didn't discover it in the sense of making it a cause militant. He didn't do that, as you know, until February of 1950. Although no man in public life can live out a week without an occasional allusion to the subject, he, in point of fact, did not become a militant anti-communist until that period. But something happened to the American community, didn't it? Especially the intellectuals, your friends, though people who undoubtedly treat you with a certain amount of awe because of your consistent anti-communism. Something happened that really churned them up. Now, if you want to ask me, do I think it's because they don't like people being smeared? I must give you a very honest answer. I don't think they care at all. Martin Luther King compared Goldwater to Hitler just a year ago. Fulbright said that Goldwaterism was nearest thing to American Stalinism. You know, all that kind of thing, every single day. It doesn't bother anybody. What I want to know is why this bothered people so very
Well,
much.
I can only tell you why it bothered me. I can't tell you why something bothers Martin Luther King.
Well, but you can
or
join
why
in
something
speculating, can't you?
I can tell you why it bothered me.
But you
I
know a lot.
believe that the charge of treason is the single impermissible charge if not true. Now, I believe the conscious lie about that charge is beyond the pale of political discourse in a free society. Now, there's much in the normal conversation that's part of our political dialogue that you might object to and that I often do. However, these latitudes are wide. It is, however, when one steps beyond those latitudes that one literally begins to erode the possibility of a vital, free society itself
By the way,
folding.
I happen to agree with you. I happen to agree with you, but I
I'm delighted.
don't think the community at large does. I think, for instance,
Well, again-
now wait a minute. I'm interested in the community also,
Yes.
because we're trying to probe a general area, aren't we? I think that you can say about a man in America today that he is pro-communist, let's say, and do him, in fact, much less damage than to say he's pro-Hitler. Though it is not, in fact, an act of treason to be, quote, pro-Hitler at the moment, because we're not at war. Hitler doesn't exist. The Nazi menace doesn't exist. So that whereas I think that your reaction suggests a deep patriotism, which I happen to share, I don't think it's fashionable. In other words, I think that
I don't think it's fashionable either.
This can account for your fury against Joe McCarthy, but it doesn't account for the fury against Senator McCarthy by all of the intellectuals and piccolo players who went into a perpetual rage over him because they don't particularly care, a lot of them, whether somebody flirts with treason.
Let me say on exactly the same level, I have learned to develop some amount of modified expectation about public response on many things, too many things. I, for one, for example, have been startled in the light of the very active anti-communist passion which is so much a part of American life, that on those occasions when in fact there has been a serious overt episode involving communism and the victims of communism, as for example Budapest in October 1956, I was altogether astonished to find nowhere in Budapest did one American anti-communist manage the resources to just get on a plane or take a train across Europe and make his way into Budapest to see if he can be of help. What especially disheartened me is that hundreds of English students in midterm made their way from Oxford and Cambridge. German students, Swiss students, driving buses, bringing Red Cross parcels, bringing clothing, some of them bringing arms and ammunition. Now, those countries do not indulge in the language of anti-communism quite as actively and fervently as you and I do. But I am disheartened that the anti-communists who invested so much passion behind Joe McCarthy, and this incidentally does include you, Bill Buckley, that I did not find your presence. I don't mean you personally. I mean those who are quick to pronounce their mortal antipathy to communism. I didn't find them in Berlin in 51, or Berlin in 53, or Budapest in 56, or Saigon in 54 or 65.
I'm trying real hard to understand you, but I'm having some
What I am
difficulty.
saying is that I am not startled that there is some gap between our perceptions and public response. Therefore, all I'm prepared to do in the course of this hour, I'll explain my involvements, my attitudes, incorrect as they may be, but I will not undertake to, in addition to conveying my own complex notions, tell you what's in Martin Luther King's mind. I'm altogether baffled. I'm often not
That's
sure.
all I wanted to hear from you.
Perhaps Mr. Cherne does not mean this personally, but I'm sure that Mr. Buckley will have a retort for him. You are watching Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr., tonight's guest, Leo Cherne, who is chairman of the Executive Committee of Freedom House. Tonight's topic, McCarthyism, past, present, and future. We'll continue in just a moment.
Mr. Cherne, let's then leave it that you are baffled by a Martin Luther King when he compares a Gold War to a Hitler, but you are outraged by Joe McCarthy. I'm outraged by both, and that does suggest, I suppose, an area of difference between us. But may I see if I can interest you in this proposition?
I'm interested in the last proposition.
Well, I'm delighted that you are. I'm delighted you are. If I were you, I would be too. You
stated the last proposition. I didn't.
That's right. One of the things that it seems to me one must search out in trying to explain the special intensity of the emotions that McCarthy aroused is perhaps the intimations of a complete indisposition by McCarthy to accept the idea of the totally open society. That is to say, McCarthy seemed to be saying, or at least seemed to be emanating from time to time, the notion that the United States is not available to people who are its sworn enemies, in this case the communists, as a living and respectable member of that community.
You mean he was suggesting that it ought not be?
That's correct. And
I don't believe he was suggesting that for a moment. Not on two counts.
Tell me why.
Well, first of all, because he was eager to accept their help when it was meaningful to him, and secondly, because I was absolutely flabbergasted at the amount of energy he spent during the years in the Senate uncovering so few communists in government when someone blindfolded might well have stumbled over a larger number that he in fact succeeded in avoiding.
Well, you're just saying he was an unaccomplished technician.
Not at all.
Which is a
I am
completely different
saying
problem.
that I find in his particular... Now, just one second. Here's what I am saying.
I'm reasoning a priori.
That when a man with such obvious skill, and I never underrated either his intelligence or skill, manages to find as conscious or partially conscious conspirators men like George Marshall, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Dean Acheson, when in fact he has to go through the laborious inventions, as he did in his celebrated nine-hour speech, of suggesting that the Truman Doctrine in Greece and Turkey was so worthy an enterprise, the country was fortunate that George Marshall was not in the country at the time the doctrine was enunciated. Well, I contacted Senator Vandenberg only to learn that George Marshall, in fact, was the person who persuaded Senator Vandenberg to give the invaluable Republican support needed in order for Congress or the Senate to approve the Truman Doctrine. Now, this is the most elaborate kind of invention.
Mr. Cherne, a very, very famous and reputable statistician counted 66 criticisms of McCarthy in this book.
A very celebrated author
for doing that kind of thing.
Misquoted me. I found 89.
Oh, you found 89? I'm sorry. I thought it was 66. So I really think, if I may,
Yes.
that we ought to proceed by accepting that. Now, let's also...
what is it you're accepting? Now, I want to know what is it you're
I'm
accepting.
accepting the notion, elaborately discussed in this book, that McCarthy drew preposterous inferences from certain factual situations on a number of occasions.
Incidentally, did he draw
But
those inferences against communists or against men you and I know were not, nor in any way in league with them?
I would say the latter, but I want you to say the latter with this reservation. I'm sure there were an awful lot of Chinese in 1949, 1950 who thought that Atchison and Marshall were communists. That is to say, people who lost their liberties perpetually as a result of the inadequacy of our foreign policy, which was then being written largely by those two gentlemen, probably thought that McCarthy was extremely lenient and extremely generous in his deductions. So it is true that during 1949, 1950, 1951, we were, as a nation, seeking reasons why we had lost so much of the globe. And in the course of seeking out those reasons, McCarthy and a few other people committed certain rationalist heresies, i.e. they assumed that what objectively happened was subjectively intended. He should have rested his case by simply saying that they were terrible diplomatic and military technicians. But even if it had been true that these gentlemen whom you just named had turned out to be traitors, even if we had found out a party card for General Marshall willed to us in his estate, that, in my judgment, would not for one moment have changed the attitude towards Senator McCarthy by his principal critics. And it is for this reason that I suggest that we've got to look to other than mistakes that in other people would be simply dismissed as trivial for reasons for that deep, deep animus. And I'm suggesting that he was a symbol of opposition to the idea of the open society, which is one of the intellectual fixations of the governing intellectual class.
You know, you've lost me. I don't quite understand in that proposition. Was McCarthy, as you interpret him, an advocate of the open society, or was he seeking to close it?
Yeah, he was seeking to close it.
Oh, he was seeking to close it.
Yes, sir.
Now,
yes,
then, I don't quite understand, even to this day, why were you so enamored of him? Because as I read you, listen to you, speak with you, the open society is an urgently necessary aspect of all that we both value.
I don't agree, no. I don't want the society to be open to certain ideas. I am an epistemological optimist, as the unfortunate word they use, to describe people who believe that by reason you can make certain exclusions, and those exclusions don't have to be reconsidered. I don't feel any obligation to protect the liberties of a Nazi or of a communist, or, as for that matter, anybody who seeks class legislation or genocidal warfare between people. So I want it to be closed, at least to that extent. And McCarthy, as I understood, scared the liberals half to death in this country because they were afraid that he was edging over towards a closed society which would exclude them.
Was he?
I don't think so at all.
Did you think you didn't think at the time?
No. However,
did he in
think
fact, however, whether he had intended to, did he not in fact, since you admit he was seeking to close this society, and you concur that it ought to be closed against these beyond the pale expressions?
Yeah.
Once he therefore blurred the distinction between that which is beyond the pale and that which is eminently respectable and essential.
Yes.
Was he not, in fact, then indeed closing the society?
No, because he was doing it particularly rather than generically.
In other words, he was seeking to close it against Dwight D. Eisenhower, but that's all right.
No, I'm saying that you couldn't safely generalize on the basis of his... After all, he campaigned very hard for Dwight D. Eisenhower after he gave that speech. So obviously he wasn't that anti-Eisenhower. He sang his praises as late as 1953, you may remember. 1954 even. But
you're only underlining the utterly immoral attribute of this man. Because it is I could not possibly imagine you saying the things that McCarthy did in that Senate speech and then campaigning for him. Incidentally, let me also in all candor say that I did not understand then and do not especially appreciate now the fact that General Eisenhower, in that Wisconsin appearance, in order, in fact, to make it possible for McCarthy to express his support for him, deleted from his prepared manuscript the 2 paragraphs of praise that he had in it for General Marshall. I doubt that you much valued that accommodation.
No, but Mr. Cherne, I've had a very limited experience in politics, but let me tell you...
I would have said that those of us on the other
that-
end of the boob tube thought you had had an extensive experience this last fall.
I don't know of very many people in public life, especially those who have attained great positions of prominence, whom you can't with your tweezers go after and make them look pretty sick. And I stipulate, you as a lawyer will understand that term, I recently learned it, I stipulate these facts. But I'm still wondering why it is that because he went into excesses about Dwight Eisenhower, the way, say, Truman did about Dewey, there was that something about Joe McCarthy that did it.
All right, shall I now again
Yes,
try to make a pass at this
Yes,
very
sir.
serious
Yes,
question?
sir. Yes, sir.
If indeed there is to be acceptance of your view, which incidentally I do not share, but I respect it, that there ought not in an open society be the opportunity to express views which are innately seeking the destruction of that society. That's your view. Now, if that view is in fact to have any credibility, if there is any possibility indeed of in time a Bill Buckley urging a community to accept that view, then I think you above all will understand why the term communist and the term fascist must be applied with absolutely surgical accuracy.
Of course you
They
can't.
cannot be used. They
Yeah.
just cannot be used as either the inventions or distortions designed to crowd into that zone of silence the respectable and urgently necessary segments of political dialogue.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Now, this is why
Yeah.
the McCarthy tendency, and incidentally, let me say that I find the McCarthy tendency devilishly active among the radicals on the left at this very moment, among the radicals on the right at this very moment, all of whom, incidentally, are not seeking, as you say you are, to exclude these ends of the prism or spectrum of discussion. They're seeking to crowd you and I out. They're seeking to end discourse in the center. In fact, I suspect if either of these two extremes, left and right, are ever effective, they will find a comfortable accommodation for each other. The language of extremist radicalism, left and right, is not significantly different.
Yeah, there is a certain congruity. Well, would you say that it was safe then to use the word McCarthyism and apply it to such as William Fulbright?
Mr. Buckley, before we get into this question, may I use your term and say that I stipulate now, sir, that it's time to take a break. You are watching Firing Line. We'll be back in just a moment.
It seems to me that considering that the word McCarthyism is almost reserved for exclusive application to the irresponsible right,
I just used
tells
it on
us
the
something
left.
about the phenomenon.
I just used it on the left.
I didn't hear your answer. I see. In other words, you believe that the word is equally usable against members of the left.
Oh, indeed.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
indeed. And given moments of history, will on occasion be much more used on the left than the right, and at other times much more on the right than the left. At the moment, I would have to say that it's getting an unhealthy amount of exercise on both ends of the political spectrum.
Well, I have never spotted its use because it seems to me that McCarthyism is really part of the larger phenomenon in this country, which is that if an unconscionable statement gets spoken, Eisenhower's a communist, for instance, the forces of propriety immediately mobilize, go into action, and consign the person who said it into a very relevant covenant.
It didn't quite happen in 1951, 52, and 53. It just did not happen until the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why I must say there was an exaggerated feeling in some parts of the community that one indeed risked his very life entangling with Senator McCarthy. Now, as one who did then repeatedly, I must say I'm hale and hearty.
What do you mean risked your life?
Oh, there was a real feeling that one risked one's entire livelihood, one's reputation, one's job.
That was paranoia, wasn't
Well,
it?
I said this was an exaggerated notion.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, this is the unexaggerated part
What is the
Those
unfriendly part?
those who McCarthy attacked. For example, you said, why, the first thing that happens, should this charge be made against Dwight D. Eisenhower, the community will immediately rise. Well, they did not rise to defend Dwight D. Eisenhower when McCarthy was tarring him in 1952 and 53. They didn't rise.
Well, I don't actually, let's use the example of George Marshall, with which I'm more familiar. The intellectual community most certainly did rise.
Well, let me tell you.
Now, one of the reasons
on that television show, Author Meets the Critics, on Senator McCarthy's book, in which his 7 or 9 hour Senate speech was published. That show had the most extraordinary difficulty persuading anyone, in fact, to take the position of critic opposed to Senator McCarthy. And I must say, they finally chose me out of desperation.
Oh, come on. They chose
So
you
I
because
was
you were the
told.
best man.
No, so I
undoubtedly.
was told.
But if you think that you couldn't go down and pick up anti-McCarthyites the way you could pick up daisies in the spring, you
Always
simply
in the
didn't open your
privacy
eye.
of a sympathetic room. Oh, it was very, very fashionable and popular to be anti-McCarthy in a room filled with anti-McCarthy sentiment.
Well, I must
It
have-
was not fashionable to do it in public debate.
Oh, I must have debated with all 500 of them then, because they certainly seem to be
Most of
ubiquitous.
those were me.
So anyway. Well, I wish they had all been as skillful as yourself, but I do think that you need to answer this point, Mr. Cherne, and that is that McCarthy's record, we have, in my judgment, at this moment, tended to distort, because I grant you the 89 excesses, or however many it was that you isolated.
Well, in what way have
but-
we distorted McCarthy's record?
In this way, we have exclusively centered on the number of people about whom he exaggerated, whereas, as you know, my own position, and I think well documented in a hefty book, is that he did uniquely stand up on the world stage, on the United States stage, address himself to a real problem, make some real and highly relevant observations, and cause a certain amount of movement in the State Department, which was vastly overdue, and that under the circumstances, many people tended to forgive him for his occasional excess on the grounds that he uniquely, as I say, had taken the courage to implement, or try to implement, the loyalty security program. Now, this, I think, needs to be introduced as part of the context of the whole McCarthy story.
Oh, it needs to be introduced, providing at the same time there is also introduced something which it was very urgent for reasons, I think, which are quite clear to me. Urgent for Senator McCarthy, and incidentally for you in your book, to act as though there just never had been any anti-communist activity in the liberal portion of the community. To act as though the Progressive Party under Henry Wallace was the total and final manifestation of democratic thought in the United States. To act as though NATO, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the wide variety of truly effective measures which stemmed the tide of communism in Europe, as though somehow or other these arose in virgin birth, in immaculate conception, out of the hands of some unknown person who, above all, clearly was neither liberal nor a Democrat.
I think it would be safe to say that we saved one person from communism for every 6 we committed to communism during that period.
Oh.
But the 6, I think, were much more conspicuous. After all, during the preceding 10 years, we had fought a bloody war, and all of a sudden we saw practically all of Europe enslaved.
You know, I'd be happier
China
with one small
enslaved.
modification of your statement.
Sure.
You said we saved one person for every 6 we committed to communism.
Oh,
No,
permitted,
I
yeah.
think we saved one person for every 6 we failed to or were unable to prevent
Yes.
slipping to
Yeah.
communism. There's a profound difference. See, that word commit
Yes,
suggests
yes,
that
yes.
somehow or other those of us who were involved
Yeah.
in that struggle against
Yeah.
totalitarianism were myopic, indifferent to communism.
Well, why don't we say impotent? How's that? That's a nice neutral word. So far as one knows, there wasn't any law under the aspect of the heavens that required us to surrender Poland to the Soviet Union. We certainly had the raw power to keep that from happening. Committing is too potent a word for you, so let's use another one.
Now, let's stay with that one.
Yeah.
No, let's stay with the particular illustration used.
Yeah.
I'm
Well-
one of those who believes that Poland did not have to be committed.
Would I be
Now,
would I be a McCarthyite in your terms?
Yes.
Because I use the word committed in the sense of what we did to the Poles after the war. Would this be a McCarthyite-like expression?
No, I think not.
You would
No,
you
I would
could
think
justify
not.
it.
Now, as a matter of fact, I want to use that, as a matter of fact, as a particular way, again, of measuring. Was McCarthy the man you represent him to be? Because, interestingly enough, the one man more responsible than any other, regrettably in his memory, for this error, and it was a serious error in judgment, was the man who represented the United States at the Yalta Conference, whom Senator McCarthy, over and over again in this book, suggests, in fact, was utterly without fault, betrayed by two men, George Catlin Marshall and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, this is demonology of the most outrageous kind. It, in fact, prevents an understanding of precisely the phenomenon you're trying to get me to agree with, is that you don't have any problem with me.
Mr. Cherne, I've read a dozen books, and so have you, about Yalta, and who actually was the dominant influence in Mr. Roosevelt's, who was the dominant influence in his behavior in Yalta? I just plain honestly don't know, but I'm not going to accuse you of demonology because you picked John, whereas I might pick Robert.
And you
Or he
really,
picks
you really
Cherne.
are that reticent about the use of that term as applied to someone who, as in the case of Joe McCarthy, said that General Marshall kept from Roosevelt's hand a document prepared by 50 intelligence experts warning him against the pitfalls at Yalta. Using this as the illustration of the conspiracy Marshall and his chief aide Eisenhower involved in, is that, let me finish, don't be so impatient. The document wasn't finished, was not completed, according to another portion of another speech by Joe McCarthy, until the day President Roosevelt died.
Well, somebody kept something from Roosevelt's hand, and let's say the wrong document. I don't think it's terribly important. I'm trying to recapture a mood in 1950 of despair over the turn of world events. And here is a senator from Wisconsin, and somebody says to him, look, manifestly, the American foreign policy is run by the State Department and by the chief executive. Manifestly, the head of the Department of State and the President of the United States cannot, had they had full access to full information, have made errors so egregious. Under the circumstances, let us suppose that there were certain influences working on them which shortened their vision. Now, I find that completely rational. McCarthy took that and he dramatized that as a point of view. And people in search of explanations for what was happening throughout the world were very, I think, logically enticed to it. Because it's much easier to believe that somebody kept a document from Roosevelt than it is to believe that he was simply a doddering old idiot by the time he got to Yalta, or that he had lost all control
Not at all
of the
difficult
moral
to
meaning of the
believe that he
war.
was a thoroughly sick man, when in fact,
Churchill? Churchill wasn't sick.
if I'm to read correctly the memoirs of Lord
43.
Morn,
43 was his attack, not 44.
I'd say he had repeated ones.
Well,
But
in other
incidentally,
words,
we are wandering a little afield. Let me ask
Except
something
in-
which is much more relevant, it seems to me, than the particular thing we're talking about. You taxed me with the attitudes of a community. And I said I can't speak for the community.
with helping you
I
to
have seen-
understand.
right.
Yeah.
Now, I have a similar problem of understanding. I'll now reverse the very metaphors or the illustrations you used. If any of the kinds of things, and incidentally the number of them are legion, I have an infinite supply of them here. If any of these inventions, if any of these crude lies, if any of these abysmal distortions, and you're a good enough scholar to have pointed to some of them in your own book, if any of these had been or are now used on the left, in the liberal community, in the democratic community, I doubt that I would find in you, or am I wrong, the detached patience you manifest so uniquely this
Utterly
evening?
wrong. You're utterly wrong. For instance, in National Review
Do you
magazine.
really honestly believe patience is one of your more endearing qualities?
No, I've never invited you to come and witness me be patient.
I haven't had the occasion to.
I'm trying to tell you, in answer to your question, and I'm sorry not to give you the rhetorical answer that you had to hop me up for. It's very simply that, yes, I do make distinctions, and so does National Review make distinctions. We never call a liberal organization, for instance, a communist front. We're just extremely meticulous in insisting that those distinctions, in fact, be made. Now, we don't want to be called heroes for it because we think this is normal civilized discourse.
Yes, it is.
But it is one thing to see somebody, like Senator McCarthy, become the arch villain of all time as a result of his failures to make distinctions when complementary culpabilities aren't also struck down. And this is something which I think you ought to worry about more than, in fact, you do.
I'm not only worrying about them, I'm trying to strike them down all the time.
Excuse me, gentlemen, a great many questions have been raised this evening, and we're going to have more questions from our studio audience coming up in just a moment. Time now for questions from our studio audience on Firing Line. As I announce your names, please rise and read your question for our cameras. First, Steve Herbst.
Senator Fulbright has recently said that serious opposition to our present Vietnam policy may actually usher in a new wave of McCarthyism. I mean, given the fact that Fulbright is under heavy criticism and Vietnam is such a sensitive topic, I'd like to ask the general question, is this sort of reaction to Fulbright's kind of position, Wayne Morse, etc., is this sort of neo-McCarthyist reaction possible?
This question, I believe, directed to Mr. Buckley.
Well, I don't think it's either likely, nor do I think it's visible at this moment. I think that, on the contrary, there has been an almost Job-like patience with some of the excesses of Senator Fulbright or Senator Morse, or some of the even more irrational ones of people like Professor Staunton Lind. We know that in New Jersey, a self-declared raises money for the Viet Cong and wishes them well, nevertheless is perfectly secure in his university, and in fact is the proximate cause for the defeat of a Republican aspirant for the governorship who called for ousting him. So I sometimes feel that we ought to go a little bit closer in the direction of making our social position felt in support of our foreign policy and in support of men who are actually on the battle line or defending, at least on the current understanding, defending America's own projected frontier. So I think, on the contrary, that we seem to have gone probably too far in the direction of an unhealthy patience. Would you agree, Mr. Cherne?
No, I agree only in part. I think we have not gone too far in unhealthy patience. I think, however, and I'm in complete agreement, that we are not sufficiently articulate, not sufficiently firm, those of us who disagree with the views of Staunton Lind or, for that matter, Senator Fulbright. We're not as emphatic as I think we ought to be in identifying our own very strong support for what at best is a both difficult and courageous foreign policy.
This next question for Mr. Cherne, it comes from Mike Crane.
Mr. Cherne, why wasn't the intellectual community in 1950 or 49 as appalled by Mr. Truman's passing over the Hiss case as a red herring when there was tons of proof to the contrary? Why wasn't the intellectual community at that time as appalled as they were with McCarthy's pronouncements?
Well, first of
and
all,
were you, in fact, yourself appalled by it, sir?
Yes, I was appalled by several things. I was appalled by the fact that those who were first alerted to a potential danger that might be inflicted on the United States at the hands of Alger Hiss were not sensitive to the alerting when it occurred. I was appalled by the altogether too ready and eager certainty that Alger Hiss was innocent at a time when I thought at a minimum there ought to have been some suspension of judgment. I was appalled in the case of President Truman at his much too ready and facile dismissal with that phrase red herring. I thought it was both an inappropriate and, if I may say, an inaccurate use both of the phrase and assessment of the situation. And let me say that there were a great many intellectuals who long antedated the concern that is described as Senator McCarthy's concern or Bill Buckley's concern. A great many intellectuals who antedated these expressions by 20 years in continuous concern with the dangers of both fascism and communism, totalitarianism in every form. This is not at all an uncharted or unexplored or unwalked area for American intellectual life. I wish there had been more, but there were quite a few.
Would you like to ally yourself with those sentiments, Mr. Buckley?
I'm sorry you phrased it exactly that way. I would like not to have to comment on it.
All right,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Our next question from Carolyn Lawrence Forsyth.
Mr. Cherne, I would like to ask you what, if anything, you would do to curtail the civil liberties of various neo-fascist organizations in this country. And Mr. Buckley, if you'd care to comment on that.
Well, I did express myself when Mr. Buckley raised his conception of what was appropriate by way of open expression in open society. I would myself not be inclined to curtail the civil liberties of the neo-fascist or communist or neo-communist segments of the community. I believe that one of the strengths and virtues of a free society resides in its ability to take this element of disease and listen, absorb, and handle the disease. Excuse me.
Well, I'd like to just comment that it seems to me certain things don't need to be listened to more than, say, once. I don't think it's necessary to read Mein Kampf again, having read it, say, once. And having read it once, it seems to me that the mind ought to be permitted to make a conclusive judgment on such philosophies as were advanced in Mein Kampf. Now, as a purely practical matter, I don't think there's any need to take George Lincoln Rockwell and put him in jail. As a theoretical matter, I insist that he has no right that I understand issuing out of the Constitution of the United States to stay out of jail.
We'll continue with firing line in just a moment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cherne. I'm very grateful to you for being here, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good night.